My name is Neal Mattison, and today we're going to go through a preparedness class. And before you start, I just want to make a mention of the notes before we start. The notes are actually my notes with some stuff cut out of it. So there's some incomplete sentences and probably some improper grammar. They were for me, but there was so much information that I wanted you to have it that I just kind of slammed it out quick. So the notes will be a little rough. The mother was downstairs, and she heard the cry of a young girl, and it had the tone of terror and horror. And she cried out, "Jeanette, Neal's bleeding!" And with that, she bolted upstairs, and when she got there, she found her son lying in a pool of blood, his own blood. He was blood from the waist down. She pulled off his pants to see where he was bleeding, and she found the spot, and she began to apply direct pressure. The boy had passed out from losing so much blood. He woke up and sat up and said, "No, it hurts, stop." And then he passed out again. But the mother could not get the bleeding stopped with direct pressure. So she ran in the bathroom and grabbed a towel, put it around his leg up high above the artery, and cranked it down with a knot and applied direct pressure. She finally got the bleeding stopped. That morning, this mother had no idea that she would have this unforeseen crisis. And yet, she was prepared. She knew something about arteries, direct pressure, how to stop bleeding, tourniquets, and she utilized it. And that's what preparedness is. It's taking necessary precautions to appropriately deal with a perceived or an unforeseen crisis. Everyone at some time in their life will go through a crisis. And hopefully what you hear today and learn and take away, you will be able to apply to a crisis situation that will deliver you from that calamity. The purpose of this seminar is to educate people to be prepared by taking action, so that what would be a crisis for most people will not be one for you. It is not exhaustive. It's meant to be a skeletal outline, a thumbnail sketch, to get you started, to give you a little knowledge and get you headed in the right direction. The seminar will come in 4 parts. First, information. Second, we'll talk about some applications. Third will be a question and answer. And fourth, you can come up front and take a look at some of the materials that are on display. Get some ideas and take some of that away. We will go through the large print in the handout, and the small print there will be for you to look at later. It will explain more thoroughly some of the ideas that I will be speaking about. So with that, let's get started. There's an old wise saying, "A prudent man sees danger and takes refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it." The year was 1982. I was a guide in the Boundary Waters canoe area for the Boy Scouts of America. And it was my job to take these kids out, these scouts, and give them a high adventure wilderness experience. Have a fun time, a safe time, learn much, and come back and want to go do it again. And that year, we were out on the water with a crew, 3 canoes. And I began to hear rumblings behind me. And so I began to ask these scouts questions. What do you hear? What does that mean? How far away is that storm? How fast is it coming toward us? What direction is it coming? And I concluded, guys, we need to get off the water as soon as possible. We may have a half an hour. And so we paddled like dogs. And we got to a place where there was a cove and a piece of land where we believed we could find a position where lightning wouldn't hurt us and where trees wouldn't fall on us. We knew we had a big storm coming. We pulled the canoes up out of the water, put them over the top of our packs, got our raincoats on, got our dining fly out, and we squatted down in a place on the earth where we believed it was least likely to be hit by lightning. And then it happened. The lightning came right over the top of us. And we were all sitting there amazed. It was as though we were watching the lightning dancing on the water. It was incredible. It made the most extraordinary grand finale fireworks look like children playing with smoke bombs and sparklers. And I imagine that even the most ardent atheist would have bowed in humble adoration at seeing the little finger of God displayed before their eyes. And when it was all over, there were just humble smiles of gratitude that we were alive. We made it. We had gotten off the water. We had seen danger, and we had taken refuge. And because of that, we had been delivered. Had we continued, we surely would have suffered harm. Another year, 1985, 3 canoes. I was the guide again, leading scouts in Ontario, in Clearwater West, a big lake up there. We had the wind at our back, and it was blowing, and we needed to go down this lake. And I said, guys, how about we do a little sailing? And they were all for it, a perfect situation. So we rigged up the 3 canoes, lashed them together with a pole in the front and the back, got the dining fly rigged up on the paddles so the guys could hold the strings and the guys in the back could hold the paddles, and I was going to run the rudder. And we took off with the wind at our back, and we were cruising down this lake. And we were just having the time of our life. And I'm ruddering, and I'm looking back at my paddle wondering, is this paddle going to snap? Because we were really moving. And so, all of a sudden, something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye that I hadn't seen before. We were watching paddles and watching everything. And then I saw a wave, much bigger than my canoe. And it came over the top and filled the canoe about 4 inches from the top. And I yelled to the guys in the front, cut the lines, throw those poles, take off, get out of here, take off. And you know what they did? They stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide. They were utterly paralyzed. And the second wave came and our canoe was gone. And the third wave came and began to flood the next canoe. And then they woke up and said, ah! And I yelled at them and I said, get to shore. Light the stoves. Heat some water. Put up the tents. Roll out some bags. We're going to have some hypothermia. The water was cold and I had some thin, smaller kids. And I knew there would be some issues. What happened there? What happened was I wasn't prudent. I didn't see danger. I was so involved in looking around at the small picture. Is the paddle going to break? Hold on to that sail! That I didn't look out over the landscape and see the big picture, what was happening. So, I didn't see danger, I couldn't take refuge, and we did suffer harm. There were no fatalities, but there's some serious cases of hypothermia. In the end, it all came out, and we worked through it. It was before Y2K that I began to be concerned, and I hadn't thought much about computers and electricity and what's going to happen if things shut off. I watched a 3-hour presentation by Stephen Harris on preparedness. And after watching that, I began to think, if my heat goes out, if the electricity goes off, I don't have water, I can't keep food cold. I began to take stock of what I had. And I took some action. As I was talking to one of my friends, who was really, he's mastered economics and the understanding of what's going on there. And by the time he got done talking to me, he said one line at the end. He said, Neal, most people don't understand the economic frailty of our economy, and that the back of this country's economy can be snapped overnight like that. And I thought, are you serious? Is he right? It wasn't that I didn't believe him, but I was very naive. What he was talking about was danger on the horizon. So what did I do? I was stunned into silence. So I began to study. I read The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve by G. Edward Griffin. I read The Dollar Meltdown by Charles Goyette. I read a paper by John Williams, a special report on hyperinflation. I read It's Your Choice by Warren Hackett. And I began listening and reading Bob Chapman's International Forecaster. And I began educating myself and seeing things that I wasn't hearing in the normal media. And I concluded this: you cannot have economic stability and sustainability when banks are not lending money and you've got a debt-based economy. When people are losing their jobs and they're not spending money. When jobs have left the U.S. forever, outsourcing, offshoring, when jobs are not being created, when the debt is greater than the GDP, U.S. and personal debt is 400% more than the GDP, and the government spends 60% more than it takes in. When taxes are increasing, when we know that lower taxes stimulates the economy, and when there's no growth in income, I am persuaded that we are in an economic storm. I can hear the howling winds, hear the rumbling thunder. I can see the storm clouds, the rain, the hail, just like 1982 in the Boundary Waters canoe area. I believe within a short time, many countries will default and devalue their currency. We will see a collapse of the commercial real estate market. The dollar will collapse. We will see terrorist attacks, biological, cyber shootings. A war will probably be started. Gas may go to $7 to $10 a gallon overnight. Hundreds of banks will collapse. Many already have. And private pension funds and 401ks, the governments will seize. And people will be up in arms. Now, if you don't think these things will happen, then watch for the following signs. And then you will know that what I am saying will come to pass. When the stock market begins to dive, even though it's driven extremely high just before, that's what happened in 1929. It was flying, and then it went over the edge. When energy and agricultural prices increase dramatically, it's a telltale sign that you're headed for hyperinflation. When the U.S. and international countries no longer buy T-bills. When the dollar is dumped internationally. When the value of gold and silver increase rapidly. When the First, Second, Fourth, and Fifth Amendment rights are attacked, threatened, and revoked, you know that what I'm saying is about to come to pass. Now, I may not be able to persuade you in 10 minutes that we are in an economic storm, but I hope you will consider the possibility that economic danger may be upon us, because if you don't see danger, you won't be able to take refuge. You'll be like me, a guide in 1985, and all of a sudden, the waves came over me, and I was not prepared. Mike Adams has said, economic collapse is not a doomsday conspiracy theory. It's a mathematical inevitability. It will happen. There are other elements that can bring about a sudden crisis and greatly limit the access to 5 of the 6 areas that we're about to look at. For instance, earthquakes, fire, blizzards, especially in the upper Midwest, ice storms, tsunamis, tornadoes, hurricanes, mudslides, blackouts, unemployment, war, famine, invasion, civil war, terrorist attacks, martial law, and oppressive political systems. What if God sent death to bring you before his judgment seat? What if the air became toxic and just down the road at Monticello power plant something happened and there was an accident? or a truck hauling ammonia had an accident? What if your shelter was no longer able to provide you heat in the winter or cool in the summer, and the fuel perhaps became unavailable or too expensive? How about water? What if your supply of water was cut off for 5 days? What would you do? Food. You lose your job. There's a 5-day blizzard. You don't have access to the grocery store. What would you do? Nutrition. What if the grocery stores were closed for a week or a month? What if that happened? Are you prepared? What would you do? What are the priorities? Without God, one perishes forever. Without air, one perishes in minutes. Without shelter, one perishes in hours. Without water, one perishes in days. And without food, one perishes in weeks. Without nutrition, one perishes in months. Therefore, get right with God, I believe, is the first priority. I was living in Jackson, Wyoming, working in a small Christian bookstore. And a man came in, an older gentleman, and I struck up a conversation. And I asked him a question. I said, "Sir, do you believe in God?" And he looked at me and he smiled and said, "Do I believe in God?" He said, "Young man, when I was a young man and I was working on a construction site, it was one of my jobs to go around with a hacksaw and cut off all the bolts that were sticking out from the steel frame building that we were making." He said, "And I got done cutting them all off, and I was on the top 4th floor, concrete underneath, and then it happened. I slipped and fell. I was heading headfirst toward the concrete, and all of a sudden," he said, "I felt a searing pain start at my hip and rip through my leg and stop at my knee." He says, "And there I was on the 1st floor. I had been caught by a bolt that I had failed to cut off." He says, "And I was dangling with that bolt behind my knee. And they got me off that bolt, and they got me to the hospital and patched up. And after it was all over, they looked that building over. And do you know what?" He said, "I had cut off every single bolt, but I'd failed to cut one off. And that was the bolt that God used to save my life." And he looked at me and said, "And you ask me, do I believe in God?" I said, "Okay, that's clear." There's 2 things in our culture that you don't talk about. What are they? Politics and religion. And why is that? It's because people have strong convictions on different positions in these areas, and some people don't like to be challenged. And sometimes, when you discuss these things, it can get a little heated, and there can be some sparks. But I'm willing to have that happen if it will produce some light by which we can walk through a straighter path and see what's going to happen in the future. A friend was watching a Western movie, and in that movie there was a cowboy who was guilty of a crime. And he found himself running through the desert. He was dreaming. And as he was running, bang! He hit this chunk of wood, and he looked up, and you know what it was? It was the judge. And he was looking down at him. And the judge was pointing his finger at him, and he was saying, "Guilty of an unworthy life." And the cowboy took off through the desert, ran another direction. Bang! He ran into the judge's bench, and he looked up, and the judge was pointing his finger. Guilty of an unworthy life. And my friend that was watching this, he was running from God. And he went to bed that night, and in his dream, he was running through the desert, running from God. And he banged into the judge's bench, and he looked up. And you know what he saw? It wasn't a judge. It was the judge of judges. God was pointing down at him, saying, "Guilty of an unworthy life." And when he woke up, the dream was vivid. And he stacked arms. He said, "Uncle." He gave up. He surrendered to God. No more running. The judge that pronounces the verdict guilty also steps down from the judgment seat and takes off the black robes of justice, and underneath are the blood-stained purple robes of substitution. The hand that points the finger guilty is the hand, the nail-scarred hands of sacrifice. As my children were growing up and they were able to run and get a little stability with their legs, I played a little game with them. And it was when they were coming around a corner and they didn't see me, I would roar, a huge roar. And they did two things. They got up on their toes, their eyes got big, and they bolted right toward me. And I'd hold out my arms, bang, and they'd run into my arms. Those little children at that age knew something kind of amazing. They knew that I can find refuge from Dad in Dad. The one that terrorizes me is also the one that comforts me and delivers me. Well, guess what? The same is true of God. We find refuge from God in God. If you travel north on 169, you'll see a sign, and it asks a very good question. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? You may leave here and be prepared and going to live a sustainable life, but what happens if you forfeit your soul? It's a rhetorical question. Not only do you not profit, but you lose everything. It's a tragedy. So, read the Bible, ask God to open your eyes, and obey His will. So, get right with God, because without God, one perishes forever. What about air? My friend came out of his house, and he just stepped out, and all of a sudden, he was choking, and his eyes were watering. And he stepped back in, and he took a closer look. What's going on? Here the prairie was on fire. They were burning the prairie. Poison ivy burning, things like that. Not the kind of smoke you want to be breathing in. So what did he do? He had things to do out there. He goes back in, he grabs his gas mask, puts it on, heads back out. Did all of his stuff. Tear gas, pepper spray, ammonia, radiation, house fire, toxic fumes, the sewer backs up. A gas mask can filter out harmful elements in the air and make it safe to breathe. Potassium iodate pills can be taken in response to a nuclear radiation threat that may help prevent thyroid cancer. When Fukushima happened, I had some of those pills, potassium iodate pills, and I began giving them in the proper doses to my family to flood their thyroid so that they wouldn't get radiation. So, acquire a gas mask, because without air, one perishes in minutes. What about shelter? A man was driving down the road, and it was a blizzard, extremely cold, and he looked down the road and something caught his attention. He saw a flash of light. And he got closer, and there it was again, another flash. So he pulls up behind this guy, and he gets out and goes over to his door. Taps on the window. The guy opens his door. And here he looks in, and it's winter. 20, 30 below. The guy's in deck shoes or penny loafers, shorts, and a t-shirt. Something you'd wear in August in Minnesota. And it's the middle of a blizzard. And he says, "What are you doing?" The guy said, "Oh, I just went out to get a pack of smokes." And his shelter failed. My guess is within a half an hour, 45 minutes, that guy probably would have been dead. Hypothermia and frozen. He was shaking already. And you know what the flash of light was? He was lighting paper in the ashtray to try to keep from freezing. It was his last straw. But he put him in the car and got him to safety. Shelter. Your clothing is your personal portable shelter. We have three primary shelters. It'd be your clothing, it'd be your house, and it'd be your car. Question: who owns your shelter? Do you own it, or does someone else? If someone else owns it, you want to get out of debt so that you own your own house. You own your own property, your own goods, and be able to heat your house in the winter and cool it in the summer if you need to. How are you going to protect and preserve yourself, your family, and your valuables? You need to consider that. You should be able to protect and defend what you own long term. You will either be a pacifist or you will use force to prevent people from harming you and from doing other things. So, secure your shelter, because without shelter, one perishes in hours. Water. Who can forget the scenes of Katrina? Water up to the roof of houses for blocks and blocks and blocks. I remember, can still see it vividly. 4 guys with a huge air mattress and some mama in the middle on that thing, and they're floating her down the street. 4 guys on each end, bringing her somewhere where they needed to go. All that water, but they couldn't drink any. Totally contaminated. Store water in glass gallon containers. 2 to 3 liter bottles. 55-gallon food-grade barrels. Have a clean, reliable, replenishable, accessible source for water. Consider, in this area anyway, a well, a sand point with a hand pump, so you are not dependent on electricity or other means for your water. How about water off your roof? What can you do with that? That can be filtered and used for drinking water, cooking, necessary things for life. What about bathroom waste? What are you going to do when your toilet doesn't work? Are you going to use buckets of water that you've stored to flush that thing? That'd be an awfully valuable use of water going down the drain. Perhaps a composting toilet would be better. A 5-gallon bucket with a toilet seat on it and a bag of wood chips. Easy to store. When an emergency happens, you can use it. Have an area to compost it. That'll work. How are you going to heat your water? Wood, propane, gas, gasification, solar, parabolic lens. How are you going to heat your water? Consider how you'll do that. Filtering water. To filter water, you want to do 3 things. First, you want to remove the debris by filtering it through a cloth bag. I've got a felt piece up here, and I've got a homemade water filter here. I would just put that over the top, pour my water in, and that way I filter out the bigger debris, the visible debris. Second, you want to treat the water for pathogenic organisms, Giardia, Cryptosporidium, E. coli, to kill that with sodium hypochlorite, which is the main ingredient in bleach. It's usually 5.25%. I give you a recipe there in the fine print in your notes, or you can move up to a Sawyer water filter, a 0.02 micron filter that will remove even viruses. Third, remove the chemical pollutants with the homemade water filter using gravel, sand, diatomaceous earth, zeolite, and activated charcoal. There's a recipe for a homemade water filter on the back of this page, and you can see the example up front. So, acquire a clean, replenishable, accessible source for water, because without water, one perishes in days. Food. In Katrina, there was a man who was at his home, and someone came to interview him. Everyone else was gone. And when they interviewed him, he said some interesting things. First, he knew it was going to happen in a week. So he had sent his family away, and he had decided to stay there and work through it. And the man said to him, What are you eating? He said, Sir, he said, look. He said, how are you doing this? Why did you stay? The man said, I have Jesus in my heart and Indian in my blood. And by that, I take it to mean Jesus in his heart, he had taken care of his number one priority. And secondly, as an Indian, he was saying, I'm a survivalist. I'm an improviser. I can make it through this. Store, inexpensive, high calorie, long shelf life, low fuel preparation food. Store what you would normally eat. Now this may be a wake-up call if you have unhealthy eating habits and motivate you to eating a healthier diet. If all you eat is frozen food or prefab foods, you won't be able to do that when the electricity goes out for long term. Consider your medical needs. Do you have food intolerances? Someone in your family have allergies. Consider alternative health cures, first aid supplies, quality vitamin supplements. How are you going to cook your food? What fuel are you going to use? Again, wood, propane, gas, gasification, solar, parabolic lens. How are you going to do that? You need to figure that out. And then, is this method sustainable? Can I cook my food on gas 6 months or longer? I would say after a solar oven, the most efficient method for cooking food is a small gasifier, which I've got here, and a stainless steel pressure cooker. In this unit right here, I've cooked an 8-pound chicken, emptied it out, cooked 8 pounds of potatoes, and I used about the equivalent of a ice cream pail, 5-quart ice cream pail of wood in this little stove to cook all that. It's very efficient. You save a lot of energy when you have a pressure cooker. That's a great way to go. You can also use a small rocket stove, would work well. Store flour, oil, oatmeal, ramen and egg noodles, mac and cheese, peanut butter, powdered milk, staple items you already use. Those staple items that you use. So acquire, preserve, and store food. Because without food, one perishes in weeks. Nutrition. There was a man who was a doctor, and he had a friend who was in Guatemala. And this guy got taken as a hostage, and he was thrown into a cave. And he was in that cave for 3 or 4 months, and they fed him one thing and gave him one thing to drink. Do you know what it was? All he got was hard-boiled eggs and water for 3-4 months. And he said when he came out of there, he was stronger, he was healthier, he was leaner, he was in much better shape. Why? Because all he got was nutrition. Eggs are extremely nutritious. Probably second to milk, perhaps. But that's all he got. Well, without proper nutrition, sickness, disease, and death can overtake you in a relatively short time. Sailors with a boatload of rum and sugar will die of starvation because they have calories without nutrition. So start with survival food for short term, and then add nutritional food for long term. You can look at it however you want. This is how I see it. Proteins. Store proteins. Wheat, beans, meat, eggs, milk, powdered, canned, on the hoof, very high in protein. Fruits and vegetables. Noodles, rice, and whole grains. Spices, herbs, and leavening agents. Things to flavor your food. Sweeteners, honey, maple syrup, molasses, sugar, stevia, whatever you like. Vinegar, wine, alcohol, and salt are all elements, agents for preserving food. Rotate your stock and replace with new. You can purchase dehydrated foods. Then, moving for long term, create your own. Begin a little garden with heirloom garden seeds. Plant what's expensive, what will store long term, and what is nutritionally valuable, and perhaps some animals you could raise. Chickens are easy. Go to a farmer's market, a local farmer. Buy, barter, sell, trade, whatever you can do. Get to know those people. If you don't garden yourself, store fresh in your cellar, dry it, freeze it, can it, ferment it, salt it, smoke it. Whatever you have to do to preserve it. Store all your foods in your house, except perhaps a ton of bulk grain that you don't want in your living room or basement. Because you want them accessible. Keep them cool and dry. So, acquire, create, preserve, and store nutrients, because without nutrients, one perishes in months. Also, your assets. Once you've taken care of your priorities, God, air, shelter, water, food, nutrition, paid off your debts, and you're prepared to live off the grid, consider converting excess wealth to gold and silver to maintain your wealth before the economy collapses. Other durable, liquidable, high-quality, useful goods can be invested in. Help others without resources. You can trade food for anything. They may not want to trade for your gold, but they'll trade for your food. Everyone has to eat. Well, this concludes the first part of the seminar. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll return for the rest of the seminar. It's 10 o'clock, about 10 after, a quarter after, we'll start. This is the second part of the seminar where we will deal with specific applications. Make some applications in what do you have to do to become prepared. First, as I said before, that this seminar is not exhaustive. It's meant to be a skeletal outline, a thumbnail sketch to get you started and give you a little knowledge and get you headed in the right direction. It will be your job to read the small print in this handout, which will expound on what has been presented. You should check out the books and the websites at the end of the handout. It will give you details and specifics on various aspects of preparedness. I would say in the website area where I list websites, the first two that I list are probably going to be the most valuable to you. One will deal with a lot of energy issues, and that's Stephen Harris's website. He's got hundreds of examples of products that he has researched and reviewed himself. Very valuable, save you a lot of time. What to do with the lights going down, using LED, how to recharge them, all kinds of those energy issues. And then to go beyond that, long-term sustainability, you'll want to look at Scott Hunt's website, practicalpreppers.com. That will help you to move further in getting off the grid towards sustainability. Second, start reading Bob Chapman's International Forecaster. That will give you information that is not going to be mainstay media. And these guys have been writing these columns for years and years and trying to work through what are some of the accurate, real statistics on unemployment and these numbers that have been created to make things look better than they actually are. So, Bob Chapman's International Forecaster. Third, listen to Before the Storm Hits by Stephen Harris. It will help you to develop a mindset to ask the question, how will I function if this grid that I depend on stops functioning? or becomes too expensive to use. Then take action. Fourth, choose an area where you're least prepared and start there. You may have to pursue several areas at once. Buy some bleach. 5.25% sodium hypochlorite, pool bleach. You can also use calcium hypochlorite powder, but you must make sure that it has no other ingredients, scents. You only want pure bleach, sodium hypochlorite or calcium hypochlorite. And if it's got a different percentage of that element in there, you need to recalculate the quantity of bleach for the water that you're going to use. Make a water filter. There's a recipe for ingredients, how to make that, at the end of this handout. Then you can begin to gather water from various sources, begin to filter it from your homemade water filter, and have access to water that you've purified. Start storing food and water. Put water from your present source in gallon jars, 2 to 3 liter bottles, and store them in a cool place. Make a water filter. I give you a precise recipe in the fine print in your notes. Or you can move up to a Sawyer water filter that is a 0.02 micron filter that will remove even viruses. It was developed from the dialysis machine technology of filtering blood. Same type of technology. That will remove viruses as well. Third, remove the chemical pollutants with a homemade water filter using the different elements: gravel, sand, diatomaceous earth, zeolite, sometimes called clinoptilolite, and activated charcoal. You can see the working model up here afterwards, and on the last page in your notes, there's a recipe for that. Next, buy some food every week. Take perhaps 5 to 10% of your food budget, whatever you have to do. Give a pop, a night out, whatever it takes to purchase and store food. Perhaps start with $50 or $100 and go out and do a purchase of a one-time bulk food. Something simple would be, mac and cheese is not the most wonderful thing, but it's always, you got a few boxes around for when you need to feed someone fast. And you can buy a case of tuna or salmon or whatever kind of meat you want to add to that. If you want to put in some eggs with that, some peas, vegetables. So start with that as a base, and you can cook a one-pot meal very simply. So for $50 or $100, you could actually purchase some pretty good main course meals for that. Decide what tools you're going to use to prepare and cook your meals. If you have a camper or an ice house, I've got some mosquitoes in here. If you have a camper or an ice house and you have a propane stove in there with a 20-pound cylinder, you're well established for cooking. Just take that and add more cylinders, and that will help you for a short-term ability to cook. You don't have to invest a lot of money because you've already got most of it available. One thing I would suggest is those 1-pound cylinders. In a worst case scenario, in most stoves will usually run 1 hour. So take a 1-pound cylinder with your stove and do your own experiment. See how long that 1 hour cylinder will last, and do some work with that. Take a pot that's uncovered, put a gallon of water in it, bring that to a boil. See how long it takes you to do that. Shut it off. Just take that same pot, start off cold water again, cold pot, and put a cover on it this time. Now see how long it takes you to boil that water. You should still have more fuel left. Start with a pressure cooker. Put that on there with a gallon of water and see how long it takes you to get that up to a boil. Then you'll know the best and the efficient means of cooking, and then you can calculate a 20-pound cylinder with your stove, how long will that last? I think Coleman makes
25, 30 different stoves, and they all run on a different quantity of fuel. They consume it. So take your stove, do a little experiment. Cost you $3 to do it with one of those little cylinders, and then you'll know how long it will last you. To cook your food, to wash your dishes, purify water, whatever you're going to do. 5, move from preparedness to sustainability. Start a garden, 5 by 5, 10 by 10, something that's manageable, grow what you like, grow what's expensive to purchase. Then recognize your ability, your skill, and utilize them to prepare yourself and others. Abilities. I listed some down here that I looked up. Gathering, multiplying, forming, planting, fashioning, building, confronting, growing, creating, destroying, giving, supplying, resolving dilemmas, preserving, and there's others. Everyone has an ability. And most people have useful skills: canning, farming, plumbing, electronics, mechanical, heating, accounting, construction. Use your ability and your skills to help yourself prepare and help others. And 6, write down your application. Write it down, tell it to someone, tell them what you're going to do and by when, so that you actually take some steps. Otherwise, all the information is in vain. You've got to take action, and you want some accountability. If you do not store the essentials that will last you long enough to make a transition to create or acquire your own, and the system which supplies it to you is disrupted or cut off, how will you provide for your family? Remember, if you don't have it now, it may be very difficult or too late to acquire it after calamity strikes. Don't let it be too late for you. Be prudent, see danger, and take refuge. Don't keep going and suffer for it. The day is coming when what you got is what you get. Take action by gathering, storing, guarding the essentials as a reserve, so that you will not perish, because without God, one perishes forever. Without air, one perishes in minutes. Without shelter, one perishes in hours. Without water, one perishes in days. And without food, one perishes in weeks. And without nutrition, one perishes in months. I'm going to make a few recommendations, general recommendations. One I brought up earlier is a gasifier or a rocket stove to cook your meals on. It's a good first place to start if you don't have a propane stove, something you were already going to build on. I recommend a pressure cooker. This is a stainless steel, I think it's about a 5-gallon, I can't remember, 2.5 gallon pressure cooker. And I do all kinds of things in that. I cook meals. It came with a little pot, but what I did was went out in the garage, made a little stainless steel lift to hold the food off the bottom, and I can put in 2 cups of water and steam 8 pounds of potatoes in no time. The other thing you can do with a pressure cooker, and even a pot, just an ordinary pot, is get a box, have some kind of insulation, blankets, hay, paper, whatever, and get your meal to a boil, get it cooking. Depends if you got meat or not. You want to use a meat thermometer when you open it up. And put this in, and that'll stay warm for a long time. So if you make one meal at 10 o'clock, you can eat another one at 2 or 3 o'clock, and it'll still be hot. Now you may have to heat it up again if it's cooled down and it's meat or something like that. So that's a very efficient way to cook. The 2 websites that I want to mention is Stephen Harris. He's first on the further references. He gives many examples and reviews on products that you can use for short-term energy and how to go about that. Hours and hours of presentation that he gives. It will save you a lot of time. And then the second one is Scott Hunt. He will take you a step further in establishing how are you going to sustain your life where it's at further down the road without some of these amenities, electricity, things like that. How can you have your own water? So those are two websites I would recommend. I want to thank you for your time and your attention. This brings us to the third part of the seminar, questions and answers. You can ask a question. I'll see if I have the answers.